You were a child, did you ever think you'd be at the place in your life that you'd be writing a huge memoir that encapsulates an entire, well, your life, but an entire sector of the cannabis industry?
I think that, I have this aspect of delusion in my DNA, and I have to be realistic about that. And I think there's times in my life where that has led me astray, and there's times in my life where that has led me to wonderful, full, great experiences. And so I think with that aspect just inside of me and then being ingrained into me by my father, who, I do write a lot about in this book. Um, my younger version of myself, I don't think that that kid would have been surprised. I think that kid might have even said, "Yeah, I expected that,"
Hmm.
with complete naivete as to what it would take or what that might look like, or even if that was something that that kid wanted, or would want, or thoughtfully, would want to construct for their life. Without any of that, yeah, I don't think it would be a surprise. I feel like this has been kind of my destiny since I was little, being groomed to go disrupt and figure things out in a creative fashion, to deliver people experiences that they're seeking. I think that's for good and bad and all the middle. And I don't know if you've read the whole thing yet, but like it's all in there and it's all those things. It's good and bad and all the middle. But no,
Right.
I'm proud of the experience. And I'm only 42 years old. God only knows
Right.
what's next.
Who knows what's ahead? Exactly. So, can we talk a little bit about your childhood? Tell us where you grew up, what kind of family you grew up in, and what you thought you would become.
I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. My best friend, the entire journey of my childhood was my father. My father is, not the most mentally healthy individual. And there were aspects of my father that are pure genius. And there are other aspects of my father, that are quite, sad and toxic.
Hmm.
And growing up in that type of a dynamic, moving around the country, going from house to house, living with someone like my dad with his outlook on the world, kind of as an outsider looking in. um, again, definitely being groomed to also look at the world that way. um, I don't think there's such thing as a typical childhood, but for me, my childhood is where I learned to be disciplined. I learned, to impose that discipline on myself. And, the biggest thing from my dad is always ask why not.
Hmm.
Um, from the time I was little, I was in all different kinds of business ventures and looking back at the level of delusion I must have had entering into them, but it was all a function of, but why not? And in some instances, there was no good reason. And
Right.
so, I pushed through.
Can you talk about some of the earlier jobs you had or quests you kind of took, paths you took?
Well, I've never had a job. I've never been an employee. I interviewed for some waiter jobs when I was like a sophomore in high school and didn't get any of those. And that was that. Um, Maybe I'm unemployable. I don't know. But in high school, entrepreneurial ventures, ranged from me giving lessons to kids in baseball. I played baseball through college, and
Hmm.
by the time I was in high school, I was charging to give lessons to the younger kids, all the way to putting on all age dance concerts, essentially, like raves for kids, without alcohol. And my senior year of high school, the biggest the apex moment in that venture was I got the Black Eyed Peas convinced to come down to Oceanside, California. This was in 2000, to play at a roller rink as part of one of these events. And so I was into all of it and, always going for it.
Right.
Um, and yeah, I mean, even those times definitely very full.
What was your experience as a child with cannabis? How did you end up getting introduced to drugs in general?
First time I smoked weed was in seventh grade. Some classmates introduced me to it, and um, After the first time I smoked weed, I found myself smoking weed every day. I did that until I was a freshman in high school. Going into my freshman year of high school, I decided to stop smoking weed cold turkey, focus on baseball, focus on school. There was nobody around me telling me that there was a way to do both. And looking back on how old I was in my developing brain, it was probably a positive to stop at that point. And
Well,
then I
meaning,
went.
wait, can I hear more about that? Like, were you taking the wrong stuff? Were you abusing it? Like, how did it manifest in you?
No, the studies are pretty conclusive that until a human brain is fully developed, there is exposure, negative outcomes to be had as a result of cannabis consumption.
Hmm.
Nobody, I am the farthest from a proponent of, anybody other than an adult accessing cannabis unless their doctor believes that prescribing some version of cannabis is going to help them with some severe medical issue.
Right.
I was smoking pot as a teenager
Got it.
and, decided to stop and try to organize myself for what I wanted to accomplish.
Right. Okay. So let's fast forward a little bit. You're in your 20s. You basically manifest this idea of a company, I'm going to say in your garage, but it was like in your home. How did that even come about?
Yeah, I detail this one scene in the book
Mhm.
where my girlfriend, she's now my wife, we've been together 21 years.
Mhm.
Um, but at the time, my girlfriend, who was going to school for her PsyD, PhD in clinical psychology, um, she and I are going to an associate's apartment in Venice, California,
Mhm.
to pick up marijuana in wholesale quantities that we then put into these Whole Foods bags, put into my girlfriend's car. I didn't have a car at the time. My car had been repossessed. I was driving around on a beach cruiser. And, we stored those Whole Foods bags in our apartment until in the next day I put those bags in the basket of my beach cruiser bicycle house, which was our first store. And so for me, like my journey with cannabis was, I was a pothead for 2 years. As a kid, I've always had this why not attitude. And then, as I detailed in the book, like I get exposed to this world of medical marijuana dispensaries in Los Angeles as a non-cannabis user and in a place in my life where I had nothing to lose because I had nothing. Again, my car had been repossessed. I was living in my parents' apartment, and I was just scratching and clawing and trying to figure out what my path would be in this world. I was introduced to this opportunity where there was so much demand that I became aware of people that wanted to walk into a marijuana dispensary and buy weed. There was
Mhm.
so much of that. And the people on the other side supplying it when I got involved, it was as if their job was to have the least amount of people knew they existed as possible.
Hmm.
And in like the Wall Street world, they would call that an arbitrage opportunity.
Mhm.
And as I witnessed that, I decided to jump in head first. And the only way at the time to do that was to open a store. Nobody was giving you information of what was really going on. This was a criminal activity at that point in time with no gray area, really. I mean, this was prohibited expressly in the law, and nobody, myself included at the time, had a license to do what they were doing. So
Mhm.
I get reintroduced back as a pure opportunity, financial opportunity. And as I wade into those waters and I get deeper into that world, the second thing happens, which is it becomes a mission and it becomes about not the money and not the security personally, but it becomes about changing the world and making it a better place. And that second, bump is really what sent me and I think this whole thing to the moon.